Welcome to the HFY Tales channel. Remember to like and subscribe if you like the story. Enjoy and take care.
The Vorgan prison loomed ahead like a mechanical beast, its steel towers reaching toward the murky sky of the prison planet Norsen. Commander Nathan cross-gazed through the visor of his helmet, his heart pounding as the transport ship rattled with turbulence. The mission was simple on paper: infiltrate, locate human prisoners, and extract. But he knew nothing about this prison was going to be easy. 2 minutes until entry, the ship's AI reported, breaking through the tense silence in the cabin. Cross looked at his team, their faces set in grim determination. They were all soldiers hardened by war, but even seasoned veterans couldn't shake the feeling of dread that came with this place. The Vorgan, an insectoid species with a notorious reputation for cruelty, didn't just imprison their enemies, they broke them. Rumors had circulated among human colonies for months: biological experiments, torture beyond comprehension, and secret projects designed to use captives in horrific ways. Nathan wasn't sure how much of it was true, but the fact that they were here, risking their lives on a rescue mission, meant there was more truth than fiction to the stories. Cross's gut clenched. This wasn't just about following orders. It was about stopping whatever monstrosities the Vorgan had planned. "We stick to the mission," Cross said firmly, turning to his team. "In and out. No deviations." His second-in-command, Sergeant Diaz, gave a sharp nod. "Roger that, Commander. Scans show we have a narrow window to breach the compound without triggering the main defenses." Cross swallowed the last remnants of doubt. They were professionals. They could do this. The ship dropped lower, and the darkened compound of the prison came into view. Jagged fences, towering watchtowers, and dim searchlights swiveled lazily, illuminating the perimeter in brief flashes. Cross's mind raced, thinking through their tactical approach as the ship hovered above the entry point, dropping them onto the cold, barren ground. Once inside the prison's outer defenses, the team moved like shadows through the grim corridors. The place reeked of decay and fear. Alien prisoners in various stages of mental and physical ruin languished in their cells, eyes hollow, their spirits crushed by the oppressive atmosphere. Cross's skin crawled as they passed, but he kept his focus straight ahead. They couldn't afford distractions. "Human prisoners should be on sublevel 6, Diaz whispered as they reached a junction. "Sensors are picking up life forms, but it's hard to distinguish. Too much interference." "We're getting close," Cross replied, his voice low. The team descended further into the bowels of the prison, the air growing colder and heavier. Cross was about to give the order to turn left when a sudden flash of movement caught his eye. He froze. In one of the cells just ahead, behind thick, reinforced glass, sat a figure unlike any of the others they had seen. This prisoner, no, this woman, was not like the broken creatures they had passed. She sat curled on the floor, her body illuminated in the dim light. Her skin shimmered with a soft, almost ethereal glow, and her features were delicate, almost painfully beautiful. Nathan couldn't tear his eyes away. "Sir," Diaz's voice cut through his trance. Cross blinked, shaking off the strange sense of magnetism that had momentarily captured him. Who is she?" Diaz glanced at his commander, then at the cell. "Doesn't match any of the descriptions of the human prisoners. Could be one of the other species they've been experimenting on." Experimenting. The word sent a chill down Nathan's spine. He took a cautious step toward the cell, his eyes narrowing as he took in more details of the woman. Her body language was tense, as if she were in constant struggle with something within herself. Around her wrists and ankles, crude restraints held her in place. But it wasn't just the chains that held her. Her eyes, a luminous violet, flickered with something far more desperate than fear. Cross tapped the control panel next to the cell, but instead of the usual prisoner details, all he got was static interference. No name, no species, no history. The Vorgan were hiding something. The woman looked up then, her eyes locking onto Nathan's. He felt a sudden surge of emotion, not his own, rush through him. It was a pleading, an overwhelming sense of need and despair that echoed in his mind. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, he felt her presence in his thoughts. "Help me," The voice in his mind was faint, trembling, but it was real. He stared back at her, heart thudding in his chest. Telepathy. He had heard of alien species with such abilities, but experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. "Nathan," Diaz asked, growing concerned. "What's going on?" He tore his gaze away from the woman, shaking his head to clear the fog. She's communicating telepathically." Diaz frowned. "You sure about that?" "I'm sure," Nathan said, glancing back at her. "And something's wrong. They've done something to her." As if on cue, the woman's body convulsed slightly, and a pained expression twisted across her face. Cross's stomach churned. Whatever the Vorgan had done to her, it was tearing her apart. "We don't have time for this," Diaz urged. "Our mission is the humans. We can't deviate." Cross knew she was right. The mission was everything. But his eyes kept drifting back to the woman, the silent cry for help still echoing in his mind. She wasn't just another prisoner. There was something different about her, something that made walking away feel like abandoning his own principles. "Commander," Diaz pressed. Nathan took a deep breath. "We get the human prisoners, but once they're safe, we're coming back for her." Diaz opened her mouth to argue, but she saw the resolve in Cross's eyes and nodded. "Understood." With one last glance at the alien woman in the cell, Nathan turned away, leading his team deeper into the prison. But even as they moved, he could still feel her presence, a lingering whisper in his mind. "Help me, please." The air grew heavier as they descended deeper into the prison. Cold, sterile walls surrounded them, and the distant hum of alien machinery reverberated through the narrow corridors. Every corner held the potential for danger, but Nathan Cross's mind was elsewhere. The image of the alien woman, Kira Al, as her cell label had finally shown, was burned into his thoughts. That telepathic plea for help gnawed at him. He tried to push it away, to focus on the mission, but the desperate look in her violet eyes haunted him with each step. "We don't leave people behind." It had been his motto as a commander, guiding him through years of service. But Kira Al wasn't human. She wasn't part of the mission. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that leaving her there would be a betrayal of everything he stood for. "We're approaching sublevel 6, Sergeant Diaz whispered, her voice snapping him back to the task at hand. "Thermal signatures show movement up ahead. Could be our prisoners or guards." "Stay sharp," Cross ordered, signaling for his team to spread out and take defensive positions. The narrow corridor opened into a large, dimly lit room. Cells lined the walls, and Cross's pulse quickened when he spotted the familiar sight of human figures huddled within. Some were in better shape than others, but all had the hollow, haunted look of people who had seen too much suffering. "Targets confirmed," Diaz said quietly, her eyes scanning the room. Cross moved to the control panel and hacked into the system, releasing the electronic locks on the cells. As the heavy doors creaked open, the prisoners stared at their rescuers with a mix of disbelief and hope. "Commander Cross," one of them, a middle-aged man with a thick beard, whispered, stepping forward. "We didn't think anyone was coming." "We don't leave anyone behind," Cross repeated, offering a steadying hand to the man. "We're getting you all out of here." The man's expression flickered with gratitude as the rest of the prisoners, some limping, others barely able to stand, began to emerge. Diaz and the rest of the team quickly moved to help them, assessing their injuries and preparing for the extraction. But even as Cross assisted, his thoughts kept drifting back to Kira Al. The urgency of their mission pressed down on him, but the idea of leaving her behind felt like a betrayal. The question echoed in his mind. What had the Vorgan done to her, and why? "Commander, we've got movement on the scanners," one of the soldiers called from his position near the entrance. "We need to move now, or we'll be caught in a firefight." Cross clenched his jaw. He knew what was coming. Vorgan reinforcements would arrive soon, and getting the prisoners out safely had to be his top priority. But Kira Al's image burned in his mind. There was still time to do something. "Diaz, take the prisoners and get to the extraction point," Cross ordered. "I'll catch up." Diaz frowned, her brows knitting together in confusion. "Sir, you're coming with us. There's something I need to check before we leave," Cross said, his voice low but firm. Trust me. Diaz hesitated, the tension between them palpable, but after a moment, she gave a sharp nod. Understood, but you better not take long. With that, she motioned for the rest of the team to move out, leading the rescued prisoners toward the extraction point. Cross waited until they disappeared from view before turning and heading back down the corridor toward the place where Kirial was imprisoned. He moved quickly, his pulse quickening as he approached her cell. As he stood before the glass again, he could see her trembling slightly, her eyes closed as if she were fighting some internal battle. The shackles around her wrists and ankles were tight, cutting into her skin, and despite the aura of beauty and grace she exuded, there was something profoundly broken about the way she held herself. Kirial, Cross whispered, using her name for the first time. Her eyes fluttered open, and the connection between them snapped back into place as if it had never left. He could feel her presence again, weak, desperate, but alive. A soft wave of emotion washed over him, carrying with it her plea for help. I can't control it much longer. Please. Cross felt a pang of guilt. He wasn't sure what they had done to her, but whatever it was killing her slowly. He quickly approached the control panel next to the cell and began to work on overriding the system. Hold on, he muttered, his fingers moving swiftly over the alien interface. I'll get you out. For a brief moment, he heard a clanking sound, and the restraints around Kirial's wrists and ankles released. She collapsed forward, weak and disoriented. Cross rushed to her side, catching her before she could hit the ground. Her body trembled against his, and he realized just how fragile she had become under the constant torture. Kirial, can you walk? He asked, concern lacing his voice. She nodded weakly, though her movements were sluggish, as if she were wading through a fog. They injected me, she whispered, her voice soft and strained. Desire, it's all I can feel. Cross's grip tightened around her. Desire injections. He had heard of them in dark corners of the galaxy. Substances used to manipulate a person's mind, forcing their emotions and physical sensations into overdrive until they became slaves to their own impulses. It was a horrific form of control, and the Vorgan had apparently perfected it. But Kirial hadn't broken. Not yet. We're getting you out of here, Cross said, his voice steady as he helped her to her feet. Kirial leaned heavily against him, her body weak and trembling from the effects of the injections. But despite the pain and confusion in her eyes, there was a flicker of strength, a resilience that shone through. As they moved together toward the exit, Kirial's presence in his mind remained, but this time, it was calmer. She was still struggling, but Cross could feel her trust in him growing, even as she battled the overwhelming sensations coursing through her. They reached the corridor where Cross had split from his team, and Kirial glanced at him, her voice soft in his mind. Why are you helping me? Cross paused, his grip on her tightening protectively. He didn't have an easy answer. Maybe it was because she had reached out to him telepathically. Maybe it was because, in some way, he saw a reflection of himself in her, someone who had been through hell and refused to give in. Because I couldn't leave you behind, he said quietly. Not like this. Kirial's eyes softened, a brief moment of understanding passing between them. But before they could say anything else, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. Cross's heart raced as he turned, seeing the unmistakable figures of Vorgan guards approaching. The mission had just gotten a lot more complicated. Cross's pulse pounded in his ears as the Vorgan guards came into view, their insectoid forms glistening in the dim lighting of the prison's corridors. They moved with unnerving speed, weapons drawn, and their black eyes glinted with the promise of violence. There was no time for hesitation. Kirial, stay close, he whispered urgently, his grip on her arm tightening as he drew his pulse rifle. She nodded weakly, her body trembling from both the injections and the strain of keeping herself upright. Cross could feel the pressure building in her. She was fighting an internal war that he couldn't fully understand. Her telepathy flickered in his mind, like a flame struggling against the wind, but her determination to survive cut through the haze. The first Vorgan reached them, its mandibles clicking in a vicious snarl as it raised its energy weapon. Cross reacted on instinct, ducking low and firing a shot that ripped through the creature's chest, sending it crashing to the ground in a heap. More were coming. Kira Al, can you use your telepathy to shield us? Cross asked, his voice strained as he fired another shot at an approaching guard. She winced, her brow furrowing in concentration. I'll try. Cross felt a surge of power through their connection, but it was faint, barely enough to register. Kira Al's abilities were too weakened by the injections, her mind clouded with the overwhelming surge of desire and pain the Vorgan had inflicted upon her. Still, she managed to project a weak telepathic shield around them, enough to buy them a few precious seconds. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice filled with frustration and guilt. I can't focus. Don't apologize, Cross said firmly, pulling her close as they took cover behind a wall. He could feel her trembling against him, her body radiating heat as if she were burning from the inside. We'll get through this. Just stay with me. He peeked around the corner, counting 3 more guards closing in. His mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and Kira Al was in no condition to fight. If they didn't find a way out soon, they'd be overwhelmed. Suddenly, Kira Al gasped, clutching at her chest as another wave of desire coursed through her. Cross turned, his heart sinking at the sight of her. Her violet eyes were wide, her breathing shallow, and her hands trembled as if she were fighting to hold herself together. They're doing this to me, she whispered, her voice ragged with pain. The injections, they're making me feel everything. Cross's chest tightened. He had to get her out of here. He had to protect her from whatever twisted experiment the Vorgan were running. But right now they were trapped, and the guards were closing in fast. He glanced around, eyes landing on a ventilation shaft just above them. It was narrow, barely large enough for them to crawl through, but it might be their only chance. Kira Al, can you climb? He asked, his voice urgent. She nodded, though her movements were sluggish. Cross quickly pulled a tool from his belt and pried open the vent cover, then helped Kira Al up. She struggled, her legs shaking beneath her, but with Cross's support, she managed to pull herself into the shaft. Just as he was about to follow, a blast of energy whizzed past him, narrowly missing his shoulder. Cross ducked, firing back at the Vorgan guards before hauling himself into the vent. The confined space made it difficult to maneuver, but they crawled through as quickly as possible, the sounds of the guards chasing them fading as they put distance between themselves and the fight. The ventilation shaft seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in a labyrinth of metal. Cross's muscles burned with the effort of dragging himself through, but his mind was focused solely on Kira Al. She was just ahead of him. Her breathing labored, but she kept moving. Finally, they reached an opening, and Cross pushed the grate aside, dropping down into a storage room. He turned and helped Kira Al down, catching her as she nearly collapsed from exhaustion. Rest for a minute, he said softly, guiding her to the ground. We should be safe here for now. Kira Al slumped against the wall, her body trembling as she struggled to regain control of herself. Cross knelt beside her, his heart aching as he watched her fight against the effects of the injections. Her eyes fluttered shut, her hands gripping the floor as if she were trying to anchor herself to reality. He hesitated for a moment, then reached out, gently taking her hand in his. Kira Al, I'm not going to let them hurt you anymore. Her eyes opened, and she looked at him with a mix of gratitude and sadness. You don't understand the injections. They make me feel things I can't control. It's not just pain, it's desire. It's consuming me. Cross's chest tightened. He had heard of desire injections before, designed to break a person's will by flooding their body with overwhelming sensations. But seeing it firsthand, seeing how it tormented her, made his blood boil with anger. You're strong, he said quietly, his voice filled with conviction. You're stronger than whatever they've done to you. Kira Al shook her head, her violet eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I can't control it, and I don't want to hurt you. You won't, Cross said firmly. He squeezed her hand, his touch grounding her in the moment. I'm not afraid. She stared at him, her eyes searching his for any sign of hesitation. But all she saw was unwavering determination. In that moment, something inside her shifted. She wasn't alone anymore. Cross had risked everything to help her, and despite the overwhelming sensations coursing through her, she could feel his sincerity. "I trust you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Cross felt a surge of emotion at her words. Despite everything she had endured, she was still fighting, still holding on. And now, she had placed her trust in him. It was a heavy burden, but one he was willing to carry. "Good," he said softly. "We'll get through this. Together." For a moment, the tension between them thickened, the air charged with unspoken emotion. Kira Al's desire was palpable, not just from the injections, but from the bond that was forming between them. Cross could feel it too, a magnetic pull that was both dangerous and intoxicating. But he fought against it, knowing that they needed to focus on survival. "We need to keep moving," he said, breaking the moment as he stood. "The extraction point isn't far." Kira Al nodded, pushing herself to her feet. She was still weak, but there was a new fire in her eyes, a determination to survive, not just for herself, but for the bond they had begun to share. Cross led the way out of the storage room, his weapon at the ready as they navigated through the maze of corridors. The sound of distant alarms echoed through the facility, but the path to the extraction point remained clear for now. As they moved, Kira Al stayed close to Cross, her presence a constant reminder of the bond that had formed between them. Despite the overwhelming desire coursing through her, she found strength in his resolve, in the way he had risked everything to save her. And Cross, for his part, felt a growing protectiveness toward her. She wasn't just another prisoner. She was someone worth fighting for, someone who had shown remarkable resilience in the face of unimaginable torment. But as they neared the extraction point, Cross couldn't shake the feeling that their escape wouldn't be as easy as it seemed. The Vorgan wouldn't let them go without a fight, and he was ready for it. The dim corridors of the Vorgan prison were eerily quiet as Cross and Kira Al moved cautiously toward the extraction point. The oppressive silence made every footstep seem louder, and the weight of their situation pressed heavily on them both. Cross's mind raced with thoughts of the looming escape and the fragile state Kira Al was in. He could feel her presence beside him, the tension in her body, the trembling in her limbs. But more than that, he could feel her mind, a faint pulse of emotion, swirling with confusion, fear, and something darker, something she was trying desperately to contain. The injections. "Kira Al," he whispered, glancing at her as they moved. "How bad is it? What did they inject you with?" She hesitated, her steps faltering for a moment before she found her voice. "It's a serum they developed to break telepaths. They amplify emotions, desires, until it's all you can feel." Cross clenched his jaw. The Vorgan were notorious for their cruelty, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. They had turned her own mind into a prison, trapping her in a cycle of overwhelming desire that was impossible to escape. "How long have they been doing this to you?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "Too long," she whispered, her eyes lowering. "I've lost track of time. Days, weeks, it's all blurred together." Cross felt a surge of anger toward the Vorgan for what they had done to her, but there was no time to dwell on it. They had to focus on getting out. And yet, even as they pressed forward, he could feel the weight of her emotions pulling at him, like a tide he couldn't resist. Kira Al stumbled slightly, her legs giving out beneath her as another wave of desire surged through her body. Cross caught her before she fell, his arms wrapping around her instinctively. "I'm sorry," she gasped, her voice strained. "I can't control it." Cross held her close, his heart racing as her trembling form leaned into him. He could feel her warmth, the way her body seemed to pulse with the effects of the injections. But more than that, he could feel the connection between them growing stronger, as if their emotions were bleeding into one another. "Kira Al, listen to me," Cross said, his voice firm but gentle. "You don't have to fight this alone. I'm here. I'm not going to let you lose control." She looked up at him, her violet eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "But what if I hurt you? What if I can't stop it?" "You won't," Cross said, his tone resolute. I trust you. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Despite everything, despite the danger and the overwhelming emotions, there was a deepening bond between them, a trust that had formed in the heat of battle and desperation. Kiraal's breathing slowed as she leaned into his embrace, her trembling subsiding for a moment. The overwhelming desire still pulsed through her, but Cross's presence seemed to anchor her, giving her a brief respite from the chaos inside her mind. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Cross nodded, his grip on her tightening. He didn't know how much longer they had before the Vorgan caught up to them, but he wasn't going to leave her to face this alone. They resumed their cautious movement, but Cross could sense Kiraal's struggle every step of the way. Her emotions were a storm raging beneath the surface, and he could feel the way she fought to contain them. But the more time passed, the harder it became for her to keep control. As they rounded a corner, the distant hum of alien machinery grew louder, and Cross knew they were getting closer to the extraction point. But just as they neared the end of the corridor, Kiraal's body tensed, and she let out a sharp gasp. They're coming, she whispered, her telepathic senses flaring with sudden intensity. The Vorgan. They're close. Cross's eyes narrowed as he raised his rifle, scanning the area ahead. They had to be quick. Stay close, he said, his voice low but commanding. They pushed forward, the tension between them thickening with every step. Kiraal's telepathy was working in short bursts, but the injections were taking their toll. Her emotions were starting to overwhelm her again, and Cross could feel the strain in her mind, the way she was struggling to hold back the flood of desire. As they reached a narrow corridor that led to the extraction point, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them, heavy, fast, and closing in. Cross cursed under his breath. The Vorgan were catching up. Kiraal, we need to move now, he said urgently, pulling her forward. But just as they were about to run, Kiraal froze, her body trembling violently as another wave of the serum's effects hit her. She gasped, clutching at her chest as her eyes glazed over with raw, uncontrollable desire. I can't, it's too much, she whispered, her voice breaking. Cross turned to her, his heart racing. He could see the way her body was reacting, the way the injections were forcing her to the edge of control. But he couldn't leave her, not now. Kiraal, focus on me, Cross said firmly, stepping in front of her. Look at me. Her violet eyes locked onto his, wide and filled with a mixture of desperation and need. Cross could feel her emotions crashing over him, the overwhelming surge of desire that threatened to pull them both under. But he held his ground, refusing to let her lose herself. You're stronger than this, he said, his voice steady despite the intensity of the moment. You can control it. I know you can. Kiraal's breath hitched, and for a moment, the chaotic storm inside her seemed to still. Cross's presence, his unwavering support, was like a lifeline, pulling her back from the brink. I can't do it alone, she whispered, her voice trembling. You don't have to, Cross said, his gaze unwavering. I'm here. The connection between them deepened, and Cross could feel the bond growing stronger with every word. He didn't know if it was the telepathy, the injections, or something else entirely. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let her face this alone. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps grew louder, and Cross's instincts kicked in. The Vorgan were nearly upon them, and there was no time to waste. Kiraal, I need you to stay with me, he said, pulling her close as he raised his rifle. We're almost there. She nodded weakly, her body still trembling, but there was a flicker of determination in her eyes. Together, they moved forward, their pace quickening as the sounds of pursuit grew closer. Cross fired several shots behind them, slowing the Vorgan guards that were closing in. But the extraction point was within reach, and Cross refused to let them fail now. As they neared the final set of doors, Kiraal stumbled again, the desire injections flaring up once more. Cross caught her before she could fall, his arms wrapping around her protectively. I've got you, he whispered, his voice filled with determination. Kiraal's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, the overwhelming emotions faded, replaced by a sense of calm that came from their connection. "You're not alone," Cross said softly. "We're getting out of here." With one final push, they reached the extraction point, the door sliding open to reveal the waiting transport ship. Cross fired one last shot at the pursuing Vorgan guards before pulling Kira Al inside the ship. As the door sealed shut behind them and the ship began to lift off, Cross let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They had made it barely. Kira Al slumped against him, her body still trembling from the effects of the injections, but there was a sense of relief in her eyes. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Cross smiled faintly, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "We saved each other." The transport ship's engines roared to life, lifting them away from the cold, sterile prison below. Cross sat next to Kira Al, his pulse still racing as the adrenaline from their escape lingered. The dim lights of the ship cast long shadows across the cargo hold, adding to the somber atmosphere. The Vorgan prison was far behind them, but the threat was not entirely over. Kira Al leaned heavily against him, her body trembling from exhaustion and the relentless effects of the desire injections. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she fought to control the emotions raging inside her. Cross could feel her presence in his mind, a swirling mass of confusion, fear, and something deeper that she was trying desperately to suppress. The ship jerked as it accelerated into orbit, sending a jolt through the cabin. Cross wrapped an arm around Kira Al, pulling her close to keep her steady. Her violet eyes flickered open, glancing up at him with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something raw and unspoken. "Are you okay?" Cross asked quietly, his voice filled with concern. Kira Al nodded weakly, though her body remained tense. "I'm trying, but it's hard." Cross could see the strain in her features, the way she was struggling to maintain control. The injections were still wreaking havoc on her system, amplifying her emotions and pushing her toward the edge of what she could endure. He wanted to help her, to do something, anything, to ease the torment she was going through, but he didn't know how. As the ship leveled out, Cross glanced toward the cockpit where Diaz was piloting, guiding them toward the rendezvous point with the rest of the fleet. The mission wasn't over yet, but they were safe for now. "We'll be with the fleet soon," Cross said softly, turning back to Kira Al. "They'll have medics who can help you." Kira Al closed her eyes, her hand gripping his arm as if anchoring herself to him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't think I could have made it without you." Cross's chest tightened at her words. The connection between them had grown stronger over the course of their escape, forged in the fires of danger and desperation. And now, as they sat in the quiet of the ship, that bond felt more real than ever. But even as he held her, Cross could feel the intensity of her emotions building again. The injections were relentless, forcing her to experience a tidal wave of desire that wasn't her own. He could sense her struggle, the way she fought to keep control, but it was clear that she was losing the battle. "Kira Al," Cross said gently, turning her face toward him. "You don't have to fight this alone." Her eyes opened, shimmering with unshed tears. "I'm afraid of what I might do, what they've made me feel." Cross shook his head, his voice firm but kind. "That's not who you are. The Vorgan tried to break you, but they didn't. You're stronger than this." For a moment, Kira Al said nothing, her eyes searching his face as if looking for reassurance. Then, without warning, she leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. The sudden closeness sent a jolt of warmth through Cross, but he didn't pull away. He could feel her telepathy reaching out to him, brushing against his thoughts like a gentle caress. "I can't hold it back anymore." Her voice echoed in his mind, filled with raw emotion. Cross closed his eyes, allowing the connection to deepen. He could feel her desire, not just the artificial need forced upon her by the injections, but something deeper, something real. It was a mix of longing, fear, and a desperate need for comfort. She was reaching out to him, not because of the serum, but because of the bond they had forged. "Kira Al," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm here." She pulled back slightly, her violet eyes locking onto his. Her breathing was still rapid, her body tense, but there was a moment of clarity in her gaze, a brief respite from the storm raging inside her. "I don't want to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't want these feelings to control me." "They won't," Cross said, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "You're in control, not them." For a moment, the air between them was thick with unspoken emotions. Cross could feel the intensity of the connection between them, the way their thoughts, their feelings, seemed to merge. Kira was fighting a battle against the overwhelming desire, but in that moment, Cross knew that she trusted him completely. Then, the moment was shattered by a violent jolt that rocked the ship. Alarms blared, and the lights in the cabin flickered. Cross shot to his feet, his body instantly on high alert as he rushed toward the cockpit. "What the hell is going on?" he barked as he entered the cockpit, where Diaz was frantically working the controls. "We've got company," Diaz replied, her voice tense. "Vorgan fighters. They must have tracked us." Cross cursed under his breath. Of course, the Vorgan wouldn't let them escape that easily. The prison had been a high-value target, and they weren't going to let anyone leave without a fight. "We're outnumbered," Diaz continued, her hands flying over the controls. "I'm going to need you on weapons." Cross nodded sharply and moved to the weapons console, his mind racing as he prepared for the inevitable battle. The ship wasn't built for combat, but they had a few defensive measures that could buy them time, if he played his cards right. As the ship's sensors lit up with the incoming Vorgan fighters, Cross felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They had escaped the prison, but now they were facing an even greater threat. And with Kira still in her weakened state, their odds weren't good. "Ha!" Diaz shouted as the ship lurched again, dodging a volley of energy blasts from the pursuing fighters. Cross gritted his teeth and activated the ship's weapons, firing back at the Vorgan ships that swarmed around them like angry hornets. Explosions rocked the space around them as the battle raged, but the Vorgan were relentless. "We can't outrun them," Diaz shouted over the blaring alarms. "They're going to tear us apart." Cross's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but before he could act, he felt a sudden surge of energy in his mind. Kiraal's presence, stronger than ever. "Nathan!" He turned, his heart pounding as he saw Kira standing in the doorway, her eyes glowing with an intense, otherworldly light. The desire injections were still coursing through her veins, but now, instead of fighting them, she was channeling that energy into something else, something powerful. "I can help," she whispered in his mind, her voice steady and filled with purpose. Cross's breath caught in his throat as he realized what she was doing. Her telepathy, amplified by the injections, was giving her access to a level of power he hadn't seen before. She was using the overwhelming emotions inside her to fuel her abilities, turning her torment into a weapon. "Kira, are you sure?" Cross asked, his voice filled with both awe and concern. She nodded, her eyes glowing brighter. "Trust me." Without another word, Kira stepped forward, her hands outstretched as she focused her energy on the Vorgan fighters swarming outside the ship. Cross watched in disbelief as the space around them seemed to warp, the Vorgan ships faltering as if struck by an invisible force. Kira power surged through the ship, creating a telepathic shield that deflected the incoming attacks. The Vorgan fighters were thrown into disarray, their formations breaking as they struggled to maintain control. Cross stared in awe as Kira telepathic energy pulsed through the ship, creating a barrier between them and their enemies. She had taken the overwhelming emotions forced upon her and turned them into a weapon of incredible power. With a final surge of energy, Kira unleashed a blast of telepathic force that sent the remaining Vorgan fighters spiraling away, their ships crashing into one another in a chaotic explosion. The alarms in the ship went silent, and the cabin was filled with the sound of Cross's heavy breathing as he stared at Kira in disbelief. She turned to him, her eyes still glowing, but there was a softness in her gaze, a calm that hadn't been there before. "It's over," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet relief. Cross stepped toward her, his heart pounding with a mixture of admiration and awe. "You did it!" Kira smiled faintly, her body trembling with exhaustion as the glow in her eyes faded. We did it together. The silence that filled the cabin after the battle was almost deafening. The once blaring alarms were quiet. The frantic hum of the ship's systems had calmed, and now there was only the soft, steady sound of breathing, both Cross's and Kira. Cross stood before Kira, his heart still racing, though not from fear or adrenaline. What she had just done, using her telepathy to shield them, to take down the Vorgan fighters, was beyond anything he had ever witnessed. The power she had wielded was both terrifying and awe-inspiring, but now, as the glow faded from her eyes, she looked vulnerable, fragile even. Kira, Cross whispered, stepping closer to her. She wavered slightly on her feet, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. The effects of the desire injections, combined with the strain of using her telepathy in such a powerful way, had drained her of nearly all her strength. But despite everything, there was a quiet strength in her gaze, a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. "It's over," she whispered softly, her voice barely audible. Cross reached out, gently placing his hands on her shoulders to steady her. "You saved us. I don't know how, but you did." Kira smiled faintly, though it was a tired smile. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, her eyes locking onto his with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. "You gave me the strength to hold on to fight back." Cross's chest tightened at her words, his heart swelling with emotion. In the short time they had been together, they had gone through hell, but they had survived together. And now, standing here with her, he realized just how much that bond had come to mean to him. "I'm glad I found you," Cross said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "I couldn't have left you behind." Kira's smile widened, and she took a small step closer to him, her hand reaching up to brush gently against his cheek. "You didn't just save me, Nathan. You helped me find myself again." Cross felt a surge of warmth at the sound of his name on her lips. The bond between them, forged through danger and desperation, had grown into something far more profound. He could feel it in the way she looked at him, in the way her touch lingered against his skin. But there was still something that weighed on his mind, the desire injections. Even though Kira had taken control of the overwhelming emotions forced upon her, Cross couldn't ignore the toll it had taken on her. He needed to know if she would be okay. "Kira," he said softly, his hand gently covering hers. "The injections, are you still feeling them?" She hesitated for a moment, her gaze dropping as she considered his question. "They're still inside me," she admitted quietly, her voice tinged with sadness. "The desire, it's still there, but it's not as strong anymore. I can control it now, thanks to you." Cross frowned, his heart aching at the thought of what she had endured. The Vorgan had tried to break her, to turn her into something she wasn't, but she had fought back and won. "Is there any way to reverse it?" he asked, concern lacing his voice. "To get rid of the injections completely?" Kira shook her head slowly. "Not entirely. The effects will fade over time, but there will always be traces left behind." She paused, her eyes meeting his again. "But I'm not afraid of it anymore. I know who I am now, and I'm not defined by what they did to me." Cross stared at her, admiration swelling in his chest. Despite everything, Kira had found the strength to fight back, to reclaim her identity. And now, standing before him, she was more than just a survivor. She was a fighter, a woman who had faced unimaginable pain and emerged stronger. "You're incredible," Cross whispered, his voice filled with awe. Kira's smile softened, and she took another step closer to him, closing the distance between them. "I'm only incredible because I had you by my side," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared experiences hanging between them. The connection they had forged, the trust, the bond, was undeniable, and now, with the threat behind them, there was only one thing left to confront: their feelings for each other. Cross's heart pounded in his chest as Kira's hand slid up to the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair. Her touch was soft, hesitant, as if she were afraid to break the moment. but the emotions in her eyes, the raw vulnerability mixed with desire, spoke louder than words. "Kira Al," Cross began, his voice catching in his throat. But before he could say more, Kira Al closed the distance between them, pressing her lips softly against his. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, but there was a deep undercurrent of emotion that surged through both of them, a release of the tension and fear they had held for so long. Cross wrapped his arms around her, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened. He could feel the warmth of her body against his, the soft tremble of her hands as they slid down his back. The intensity of the moment, the culmination of everything they had been through, flooded his senses, leaving him breathless. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were panting slightly, their foreheads resting against each other as they tried to catch their breath. "I've wanted to do that since the moment you saved me," Kira Al whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Cross chuckled softly, his hand gently caressing her cheek. "I'm glad you did," he said, his voice equally full of emotion, "because I felt the same way." For a moment, they simply stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the weight of the universe falling away as they lost themselves in the connection they had built. The danger, the fear, the uncertainty, it all faded in the face of the undeniable bond they shared. But even as they stood together, basking in the warmth of their newfound intimacy, Cross knew that this was only the beginning. The Vorgan might have been defeated for now, but there would be more battles ahead, more challenges to face, and he knew, without a doubt, that he wanted to face them with Kira Al by his side. "What happens now?" Kira Al asked softly, her fingers tracing small patterns on his chest. Cross smiled, his hand gently stroking her hair. Now we go back to the fleet. We'll get you the medical help you need, and then we figure out the rest together." Kira Al's eyes softened, and she nodded. "Together," she echoed, her voice filled with quiet determination. As the transport ship continued its journey through the stars, Cross and Kira Al sat together, their hands intertwined, their bond stronger than ever. They had survived the horrors of the Vorgan prison, overcome the effects of the desire injections, and found something they hadn't expected: each other. And no matter what the future held, they knew one thing for certain: they would